Tonight on Primetime, hopes of diplomacy collapse as Washington and Tehran return to open confrontation, raising fears that the region is sliding towards a wider and far more dangerous conflict once again. As the diplomatic window slammed shut. Welcome to Primetime. I'm James Ezimoha. Iran has launched ballistic missiles at American forces in Middle East, ending a 3-day pause and triggering fresh US and Saudi strikes. Here's more.
The United States says Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles at American forces in the Middle East in what it described as an attempted surprise attack. According to US Central Command, all of the missiles were successfully intercepted and no target locations were disclosed. In response, US and Saudi Arabian forces carried out strikes on what Central Command called Iran-aligned terrorist logistics and weapons sites in eastern Iraq. Washington says the operation was a direct response to more than 30 drone attacks over the past 72 hours, which it says were directed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Central Command warned that Iran and its allied groups must stop the attacks or face further military action. Iran has not yet commented on the latest developments. Earlier in the day, Saudi Arabia said it had intercepted drones targeting petroleum facilities in the country's eastern region. The renewed exchange of strikes comes just one day after US President Donald Trump spoke of what he described as very friendly negotiations with Iran. The latest military action ends a 3-day pause in fighting that had raised hopes for diplomacy. That pause followed nearly 2 weeks of US airstrikes in southern Iran, which Washington says targeted tunnels and bridges. Despite talk of possible negotiations, major differences remain, particularly over the Strait of Hormuz, while Tehran continues to deny that any formal talks are taking place.
Iran, meanwhile, says the attack targeted a US base in Jordan as the Revolutionary Guards issued fresh warnings over Washington's military actions at sea. Turaj Shiralilu has more.
Iran's Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, confirmed that its aerospace force targeted a US military base in Jordan with scores of ballistic missiles early on Wednesday. According to Sepah News, the IRGC stressed, and I quote, the threats by the US officials and their illegal interventions against Iran's interests shall stop. The missile strike came after 2 days of a lull when tit-for-tat attacks between Iran and the US had stopped. However, Wednesday's strike coincided with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington, the first in 5 months. It's amid reports that US President Donald Trump is dissatisfied with Israeli intelligence. In another development, the Revolutionary Guard said its Navy units hit and stopped 3 tankers at Iran's sovereign waters, which it said intended to transit through what it called unsafe and illegal routes. The force warned in a statement, and I quote, illegal interventions and embargoes of the US military against vessels in the region will not go unanswered. It referred to the US blockade of Iran's ports and its escorting of vessels at the Strait of Hormuz. Meantime, the spokesman for the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters warned that any company or country that receives money from frozen Iranian assets will not be allowed to pass through the strategic waterway. According to the Defa Press website, which covers Iran's military and defense news, Ebrahim Zolfaqari slammed US President Donald Trump's threat of compensation for vessels damaged in the war from Iran's blocked assets. Previously, on Monday, the Joint Operational Command of Iran's armed forces had warned that any US effort to impose a naval blockade on Iran would be regarded as an escalation of the conflict, promising that the Iranian armed forces would respond to any hostile action. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Joining me now from Bonn is Dr. Desiree Kaiser, a Middle East expert. Good to have you, Desiree.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you. Now, this attack came just hours after President Trump spoke of very friendly negotiations. Is diplomacy now effectively dead?
No, I would not say diplomacy is dead, but it has become much more fragile. We have to remember that Washington and Tehran are trying to negotiate while simultaneously applying military pressure. So President Trump described the talks as very friendly, whereas Iran was more cautious. Tehran confirmed that messages were being exchanged through intermediaries, but denied formally requestioned negotiations. So the latest attack demonstrates the central contradiction. Iran may believe it needs to negotiate from a position of strength, while Washington believes military pressure will force Tehran to make concessions. However, once American forces are directly targeted, the political space for restraint in Washington becomes much more narrow. So I would say diplomacy is not dead, but it is now operating under fire with a much greater risk of miscalculation.
Now, Iran says it targeted a U.S. base in Jordan, while Washington has not identified the location yet. What do you make of those conflicting accounts?
At this stage, we have to distinguish carefully between confirmed information and the claims made by the different parties. Well, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard says it targeted an American military facility in Jordan. CENTCOM has confirmed that Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles toward US forces in the Middle East and says that all of them were intercepted. However, Washington initially avoided identifying the precious target. These accounts are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The United States may be withholding the location for operational security reasons, while Tehran has an obvious interest in presenting the attack as precise and successful. So, the most important questions are whether the missiles penetrated the defenses, caused casualties, or disrupted American operations. So far, there is no confirmed evidence of casualties from this particular barrage. We should therefore not confuse a declared target with a successfully struck target, though this also places Jordan in an extremely difficult position. It hosts Western military assets, but it does not want to become an active battlefield in a US Iranian war.
Now, the United States has responded by striking Iran-aligned sites in Iraq. How close is Baghdad to being dragged deeper into this conflict?
Baghdad is dangerously close, and in many respects, Iraq is already being drawn into the conflict. The United States and Saudi Arabia have acknowledged coordinated strikes against Iran aligned sites inside Iraq. Iraqi authorities have condemned these attacks as violations of Iraqi sovereignty, while reports indicate significant casualties among members of the Popular Mobilization Forces. The fundamental problem is that some Iran aligned armed groups are formally connected to the Iraqi security system, but continue to maintain their own political loyalties and chains of command. Baghdad cannot easily control or disarm them, but it also cannot prevent foreign relations when these groups are accused of attacking American or Saudi targets. Iraq therefore risks becoming the arena in which other regional powers settle their conflict. Continued escalation could weaken the Iraqi state, intensify militia mobilization, and increase the danger to Western personnel in the country.
Now, Desiree, this appears to be a direct Iranian attack rather than action through an allied group. Does that mark a significant escalation in Tehran's strategy?
Yes, politically and strategically, this is a significant escalation. For many years, Iran relied heavily on allied groups across the region. Why? Because they provided strategic reach and a degree of plausible deniability. A missile attack launched directly from Iranian territory removes much of that ambiguity. It creates clearer state responsibility and increases the likelihood of American retaliation against Iran itself. At the same time, Tehran may have tried to calibrate the attack. If Iranian planners expected the missiles to be intercepted and deliberated avoided causing mass casualties, the objective may have been to demonstrate resolve without triggering an unlimited American response. But calibrated escalation remains extremely dangerous. Air defense systems can fail, intelligence can be wrong, and one missile causing American casualties could fundamentally change Washington's calculations.
Now, Desiree, finally, Netanyahu is in Washington amid reports of tension over Israeli intelligence. Could his visit influence whether President Trump escalates or steps back?
Yes, Netanyahu can certainly influence the discussion, but he cannot simply determine President Trump's decision. Netanyahu will argue that Iran cannot be trusted, that military pressure must continue, and that Tehran may be using negotiations to protect or rebuild its remaining capabilities. The latest Iranian attack strengthens that argument. However, Trump faces a broader set of American considerations: the cost of a prolonged campaign, pressure on energy markets, the strain on air defense resources, and domestic opposition to another open ended war in the Middle East. The reports of tensions over Israeli intelligence are also important. Trump does not want to appear as tough through American strategy as being dictated by Netanyahu or by Israeli intelligence assessments. And Netanyahu can shape the threat assessment, but Trump will ultimately make his decision based on what he perceives as American political and strategic interests. So I think the most likely scenario is a visible but limited military response combined with an attempt to keep indirect diplomatic channels open. Trump will want to demonstrate strength without automatically committing the United States to an unlimited regional war.
That was Dr. Desiree Kaiser, a Middle East expert, joining us from Bonn. Good to have you, man.
Thank you so much.
All right, after the break, we'll look at Turkey's new stake in Iraq's Kirkuk oil field and what it could mean for regional energy ties. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Now, President Erdogan has announced that Turkey's state-owned energy company, Turkish Petroleum, will become a partner in Iraq's Kirkuk oil field. Standing alongside Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi in Ankara, Erdogan hailed the newly signed agreement as a historic step towards deeper energy cooperation. President Erdogan said Turkey and Iraq were working towards a new energy agreement that could see Baghdad supply up to 1 million barrels of oil a day. He added that Iraq's peace and stability were vital to Turkey's security, with both sides seeking closer cooperation across energy, transport and defense.
British Petrol'ün operatörlüğünü yürüttüğü
The Kirkuk production field has been granted to Turkish Petroleum as a partner. The agreement signed today is a historic step in terms of partnership in the energy sector. We are striving to ensure that our region is known not for war, terrorism and conflict, but for development, prosperity, peace and stability. Turkey has never viewed Iraq's peace and stability separately from its own security, because Iraq is one of the countries that has suffered from war and instability. The Development Road Project, which aims to connect the Gulf region to global markets through Iraq, has become even more important under the current regional circumstances. Ankara remains in close dialogue with Iraq to advance its terror-free Turkey process and its vision of a terror-free region.
Now, beyond the Kirkuk deal, Ankara and Baghdad are pushing a broader strategic partnership, but renewed regional strikes are already testing their shared commitment to stability. Adam Morrow has more from Istanbul.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Ali al-Zaidi to the presidential complex in Ankara on Tuesday evening, before the two leaders held closed-door discussions and addressed a joint press conference. Speaking to reporters, Erdogan said Turkey-Iraq relations had entered what he described as a more strategic phase, stressing Ankara's readiness to support Baghdad and step up bilateral ties. The two leaders said they had discussed a range of issues, including trade, energy, transportation, regional security, and counterterrorism. Erdogan said terrorism had exacted a heavy price on the region, adding that Iraq and Turkey would continue working together to address common security threats. Energy was also a key focus, with the Turkish president saying Ankara hoped to sign a fresh energy framework deal with Iraq following the expiry earlier this week of a previous framework agreement. He also said al-Zaidi had offered to supply Turkey with 1 million barrels of oil per day, adding that this would be more than enough to meet all of Turkey's energy needs. The two leaders also hailed the emerging Development Road project, a planned rail and road corridor that would link Iraq's Grand Fa port on the Persian Gulf to Turkey before continuing onward into Europe. The project aims to reduce transit times, diversify regional trade routes, and enhance Iraq's role as a key logistics hub, while also deepening economic integration with Turkey. Erdogan noted that bilateral trade had reached $7 billion in 2025, going on to voice confidence that Turkey-Iraq economic ties would continue to grow in the years ahead. The meeting ended before regional tensions escalated again overnight, with the United States and Saudi Arabia launching multiple strikes against targets in Iraq. Al-Zaidi, for his part, has yet to issue a statement on the joint U.S.-Saudi operation. But speaking in Ankara, both leaders had stressed the importance of preserving peace in the region. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Joining me now from Istanbul is John Bolos, an energy geopolitics expert and founder of Energy Straits. Good to have you, John.
Thanks, you. Good to be with you.
Now, Turkey says Turkish Petroleum will become a partner in the Kirkuk outfield. How significant is that, and what does Ankara gain beyond additional crude?
It's very significant. It's the first step, and I'd like to point out a historic note here, is that it's exactly 100 years ago where Turkey, as part of what was then the Turkish Petroleum Company, kind of conceded to the British companies and to Iraq an agreement called the Treaty of Ankara. So this comes 100 years later, in which Turkey is now taking a stake in Iraqi crude for the first time. So it's quite a big deal. It is not a surprise in the sense that Turkey has signed a series of MOUs with Western companies such as Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, of course, that's the news today, and Shell, to jointly explore for oil, and largely that was considered and expected to come in Iraq. So this is kind of the fruit of those agreements over the past 6 to 9 months. And, for Turkey to have actually, a meaningful stake in Iraqi oil, not just as a transit country that can ferry it, from the Iraqi border to the Mediterranean, but actually have a stake in the industry itself will, bring the two countries together, I think, more, and they're real partners in a different way now than ever before.
Now, speaking about real stakes, Iraq has reportedly offered Turkey up to 1 million barrels of oil a day. Is that commercially and logistically realistic, or chiefly a statement of political ambition?
It's absolutely possible. The current pipeline from the Turkish border to Turkish-Iraqi border to the Mediterranean has a nameplate capacity of 1.5 million barrels per day. So that is possible. Now the challenge is to get it to that border in Fish Kaybur, it's called. There's currently a pipeline running from the predominantly KRG controlled area, which can go up to, I believe, 400,000 barrels a day. Iraq is currently working to rehabilitate, though, this other pipeline that, it goes south and it connects in the western part of Iraq in Haditha. then that line runs up to Turkey. That pipeline was taken out of commission during the ISIS incursions in 2014. It really came offline. So Iraq has only had this kind of smaller pipeline through the KRG territory. Now, this old federal line still passes through the KRG, so it's not that the KRG will be entirely sidelined from this project, but that this although depends actually on Iraq much more than Turkey. As I said, they have the capacity in Turkey. Iraq is trying to bring its southern oil fields up through Haditha, as I mentioned, in western Iraq. And so they don't have a pipeline yet there to bring that up. The actual oil exists, and there are new agreements being signed. Most, I think, well known these days is how Chevron has kind of, it's in negotiations right now to kind of assume control over Lukoil's abandoned West Kurna 2 field. So, and most of Iraq's oil, of course, is in the south. So, if that pipeline can come up to Haditha, and then again from Haditha up to Fish Khabur, then there is definitely enough oil. And I said within Turkey, there's definitely enough capacity if all these pipelines get built. A lot of ifs you're hearing.
Now, the previous energy framework has expired and negotiations are beginning again. What are the biggest obstacles to securing a lasting agreement?
It's very, from Turkey's perspective, they want a big deal. And that's part of what came out of the communique yesterday. That they want as much oil to come through it as possible, but they also want to build potentially a gas pipeline, an electricity line, petrochemicals. That won't be in a pipeline, but Turkey wants a huge deal here. Iraq, on the other hand, doesn't want to necessarily commit all of its future resources to Turkey. It's playing, it doesn't want to depend on one exit corridor, right? So it is, I'm sure your listeners, your watchers are aware that they recently signed an agreement with Syria to build another pipeline from, again, Haditha in western Iraq to the Mediterranean coast in Syria at Banyas. This would give serious optionality to Iraq to, okay, well, we can send oil to both to Turkey and to Syria in both directions. So there's a complex kind of jockeying going on, among Turkey, especially within Turkey-Iraq negotiations at the moment. The Turks want as much as Iraq will send, and Iraq needs that too, but it doesn't want to, as I said at the beginning, depend on that. So we have to see how all these kinds of pipeline negotiations play out. Yes, there's no formal agreement, and it's kind of strange. I mean, we just can't get an actual agreement to be published and known. But we, earlier this month, a Turkish energy minister, Bayraktar, said, we intend to have a 1-year agreement. We, again, don't have that text, but there's just kind of no way that they would stop sending oil from Iraq up to Turkey at this point, just for obvious reasons that both countries want that connection to happen. And there's no reason for Turkey to really play kind of hardball and be like, well, we don't have an agreement, you can't send it to us, this kind of thing. As many things often get done in this part of the world, informally, and they'll just happen, and that's fine. And I expect oil to keep flowing until Turkey gets this kind of larger deal that that Iraq agrees to, and they reach some kind of agreement. But it's they're negotiating bigger things than just a pipeline treaty and what transit fees Baghdad will pay Ankara throughout this process.
Mm-hmm. Now, the development road would connect Iraq's Grand 4 ports to Turkey and onward to Europe. Could it reshape regional trade and strengthen Turkey's role as an energy hub?
Absolutely. That's the aspiration, of course. It's not just energy, it's trucking, it's connectivity. All kinds of trade could be stimulated by this. Erdogan called it, I think, a third river. Oil could flow from this. Turkey is the most logical overland transit corridor in the region, particularly for Iraq. just geographically. It has ample ports. It's demonstrated since the 1970s that it's a transit partner that you can rely on. So yes, is the short answer. It would transform things. And imagine if one day, Iran was not, on the opposite side of everything. That tie-in would also just be a boon for the region and commercially in these ways, and peace. So, these projects are good to have, these aspirations. They take a long time to build. Political will needs to be developed, and trust, and all these things. So until they are developed, we can't really count on them.
All right. Now, with renewed strikes inside Iraq, how vulnerable are these energy projects and the infrastructure supporting them to prolonged regional instability?
Well, that's undoubtedly they are vulnerable. We've seen with the Ukraine theater and the Iran theater, you can strike energy targets from, up to 1,000 kilometers away with cheap drones and these kinds of things. So they are vulnerable. Iraq is also, I would say, kind of on the front lines of this whole conflict, and it has been for, decades almost, just with the political makeup of the country, the role of Iranian-backed militias, and kind of, they're there and they can just attack these assets. I think it's important to bear in mind with pipelines, if you actually hit a pipe, that part of it, it's not going to take it offline for more than a couple days, a few days, something like that. But if you hit a pumping station or an export terminal, these kinds of things, then you're talking weeks, months, that kind of thing. So, I think the whole world is vulnerable at this point, in this new age of warfare. And unfortunately, Iraq is going to live through this to some extent, and it's going to threaten, the Iraq Development Road and these new pipelines and such infrastructure. So.
Thank you. That was John Bolos, an energy geopolitics expert and founder of Energy Straits, joining us from Istanbul. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll check in with our correspondents around the globe. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Prime Time. Now, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says hundreds of billions of euros must be cut from the EU's next long-term budget as Ireland prepares a revised proposal by October. Willem Denslow reports from Brussels.
In response to the European Commission's proposed €2 trillion multi-annual financial framework, or MFF, this budget for the EU's next cycle, Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, described it as unacceptable and not balanced. He says that he wants to see essential cuts made that could save hundreds of billions of euros. Now, the comments came from Friedrich Merz speaking alongside Michel Martin, the Taoiseach of Ireland. Ireland, of course, that holds the rotating presidency of the European Council for the second half of the year. And they are tasked with finding consensus among the bloc on this budget by year's end. Now, Friedrich Merz has also railed against proposals that could see under this budget roughly 2,500 EU institution jobs added. He says essentially this is unacceptable, especially at a time where Germany is seeking to cut roughly 8% of government staff by the year 2029. Dublin has a difficult balancing act. While predominantly northern European nations like Germany want to see the budget reduced, there are other nations that really want to see the opposite. The likes of Spain, the likes of Italy, Poland as well want to see a hefty budget really to help us services across the bloc. There are huge calls for more spending, especially when it comes to the EU's efforts to be more competitive on the global stage, support for key sectors such as agriculture, as well as more money for defence. That, of course, a huge priority for the likes of Poland, those that border Russia. For Ireland, well, it is a difficult negotiating period for them, and this all comes as Ireland hopes to see a degree of consensus formed by the time that European leaders gather here in the Belgian capital in October. William Denslow, Frey News in Brussels.
Now, more than 4,000 people have been ordered to evacuate France's Gironde region as wildfires reignite and temperatures threaten to exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Ross Cullen reports from Bordeaux.
Well, I'm here at an evacuation centre in Bordeaux where hundreds of people continue to be cared for around the clock after having been forced to leave their homes. There was some good news for some of the people here on Tuesday. They were allowed to return home after their houses were declared to be in a fire-safe zone. But there were also thousands more evacuations in an area far to the west of Bordeaux. So it shows that the situation remains very challenging. But the biggest issue potentially on Wednesday is going to be the high temperatures here, around 42 to 43 degrees Celsius. Another heat wave pummeling the region. The ground is very dry. We've had the extremes of weather this year, a very wet winter spurring lots of growth of grasses, which have then been turned tinder dry by successive heat waves. This is the fourth such heat wave we've had so far this summer. So the challenge for the fire brigade is going to be to ensure that these high temperatures don't cause new fires to start or previously controlled blazes to reignite. Ross Cullen, A News, Bordeaux.
Now, over in Africa, Sudan's military says it has made further gains in North Kordofan as aid agencies warn of a deepening humanitarian crisis. Naba Muhyiddin reports from Khartoum.
The conflict in Sudan continues with the army announcing new territorial gains in North Kordofan. The army chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has recently visited newly recaptured towns after the army says it had pushed the RSF fighters. The army says the operations aimed at expanding its control, but fighting remains active in parts across the state. As the conflict continues, the humanitarian agencies warn that civilians are bearing the brunt. The UNICEF says at least 23 children have been killed in North Kordofan since May. The violence around Al-Ubaid continues. The war in Sudan has now entered its fourth year, displacing more than 13 million people and leaving millions more in need of humanitarian assistance. So despite the army gains, the humanitarian situation is likely to worsen even further. Naba Muhyiddin for A News, Khartoum, Sudan.
Now, Tbilisi's electricity supply is now tangled in the EU's sanctions war with Moscow. Brussels has blacklisted a Russian energy giant that indirectly controls the very company that powers the capital. Our Nini Nikolashvili has more from Tbilisi.
The European Union has added Russian state-controlled energy company Interro to its sanctions list as part of the bloc's 21st package of sanctions against Russia, approved on July 23rd. The Council of the European Union describes Interro as one of Russia's largest energy companies controlled by the Russian government. The move has raised questions here in Georgia because Interro indirectly owns a 75% stake in Telesi, Tbilisi's main electricity distributor, as well as electricity supplier Telmiko and Khrampasi, first and second hydropower plants. Under EU sanctions rules, banks and companies based in the bloc may face restrictions on providing financial services or conducting transactions with entities that are directly or indirectly controlled by a sanctioned company. Although neither Telesi nor Telmiko has been sanctioned, their banking relationships could potentially be affected due to Interro's ownership. The National Bank of Georgia has sought to reassure the public, stating that local banks will continue providing services to Telesi because the company itself is not subject to sanctions and its uninterrupted operation is considered essential. The issue has also sparked political debate. Opposition representatives argue that the government had several years to reduce Interro's stake in Georgia's energy sector following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Among them, Levan Gogichaishvili of the Gacharia for Georgia party has called on the government to reduce Interro's ownership stake in order to address the impact of the EU sanctions. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A News.
Russian refinery disruptions are squeezing Kyrgyzstan's fuel supplies, forcing Bishkek to secure alternative imports as freight prices surge. Farzi Kalimoziner has more.
Kyrgyzstan is seeking fresh fuel supplies from Russia as disruptions at Russian oil refineries continue to reduce exports. A government delegation is in Moscow negotiating monthly deliveries of 100,000 tons of petroleum products at market prices, according to First Deputy Prime Minister Danila Mangaldiv. The talks follow Ukrainian drone strikes that forced production cuts at several Russian refineries, limiting fuel available for export. The impact is significant for Kyrgyzstan, which imports more than 90% of its petrol from Russia. To reduce its dependence, Bishkek has signed contracts for diesel and aviation fuel from Belarus and China and is seeking additional supplies from neighboring countries. At home, the government has imposed an indefinite ban on petroleum product exports to safeguard domestic supplies through the end of the year. Officials also face rising import costs. Mangaldiv says petrol prices have jumped from about $860 to as much as $1,400 per ton under some recent contracts, driven by supply shortages and geopolitical tensions. And to ease the burden, the government has introduced the state-funded compensation scheme for suppliers of EI-92 petrol and diesel, while EI-95 will continue to be sold at market prices. Farisa Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Now, Turkmenistan and Iran are seeking to expand their $600 million trade relationship through closer energy links, transport corridors, and cross-border commerce. Savira Rajapova reports from Tashkent.
Turkmenistan and Iran have been discussing cooperation in energy, transport, construction, agriculture, and trade. Turkmen President Serdar Berdimuhamedov met with Iranian Minister of Roads and Urban Development Farzaneh Sadegh Movajered and included talks with Turkmen Foreign Minister Rashid Meredov. Officials reviewed bilateral relations and agreed to strengthen the role of the Turkmen-Iranian Intergovernmental Commission on Economic Cooperation. Iran is one of Turkmenistan's leading trading partners, with annual trade approaching $600 million. Cooperation already includes natural gas swap agreement, electricity transmission and transport corridors, while both countries are working to increase cross-border cargo traffic to 20 million tons a year and establish joint free trade zones along their shared border. During the visit, Iran also congratulated Turkmenistan on the recent United Nations General Assembly resolution proclaiming 2028 the International Year of International Law, an agreement proposed by Ashgabat and co-sponsored by Tehran. It is Savira Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Now, Pakistan and Kuwait are strengthening their security partnership amid heightened regional tensions and recent attacks on the Gulf state. Mariam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Kuwaiti Foreign Minister Sheikh Jarrah Jabir Al Ahmed Al Sabah arrived in Islamabad on Tuesday. The visit came days after Kuwait ratified a 5-year defense cooperation agreement with Pakistan. The agreement was originally signed in 2023. Al-Sabah will hold talks with Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar and senior Pakistani leadership on Wednesday. The discussions are expected to cover bilateral ties, defense cooperation, and regional developments. The agreement expands cooperation in military training, intelligence sharing, defense technology, and joint exercises. It also establishes a joint military committee to oversee its implementation. The visit follows months of military and diplomatic engagement between both the countries. It also comes in the backdrop of recent attacks on Kuwait, underscoring the growing importance both sides attach to defense cooperation and regional security. Mariam Zia, A News, Islamabad.
Now, the Caucasus Mountains are providing a spectacular stage for world-class performers and emerging talent at the 15th Gebele International Music Festival. Our Dilek Tuna is there and sends us this report.
Hello from Gebele. Over the next few days, this beautiful mountain town will once again become the cultural heart of Azerbaijan as it hosts the 15th Gebele International Music Festival. Now, this isn't just about classical music. This year's festival brings together performers from Azerbaijan and several other countries with a program that includes orchestral concerts, traditional music, dance, performances, and for the first time, a wider celebration of art and culture with exhibitions, craft fairs and creative activities. The opening ceremony was underway on Wednesday evening, and throughout the festival, audiences will be treated to performances by internationally recognised musicians alongside emerging young talent, all set against the stunning backdrop of the Caucasus Mountains. Over the next 2 days, we'll be taking you behind the scenes, speaking with performers and organisers and bringing you the atmosphere from one of Azerbaijan's best-known international cultural events. From Gebele, Dilek Tuna and Natik Mehmedov for A News.
All right, after the break, we'll take a look at the latest news on the Russian-Ukraine war. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Now, Ukraine's president says Kyiv has struck several Russian targets in border regions, including a logistics center, an oil refinery and facilities in Rostov and occupied Crimea. In response, Russia's defense ministry said its forces struck 2 vessels carrying weapons and military equipment to Ukrainian ports near Odessa. Meanwhile, Russian officials reported Ukrainian drone strikes in the Belgorod region that killed 3 people and injured 19 others. Further strikes were reported in other Russian regions, with online retailer Wildberries saying it evacuated one logistics hub following safety advice. Now, Russia's largest online retailer, Wildberries, is facing a severe crisis after Ukrainian drone strikes destroyed key warehouses, with thousands of sellers facing massive financial losses. The Kremlin is now considering emergency support. To survive the sudden storage shortage, the retail giant is looking to expand its operations into neighboring Kazakhstan.
The Russian government is considering support measures for the country's largest online retailer, Wildberries, and thousands of businesses that rely on its platform. The move comes after Ukrainian drone strikes damaged 7 of its warehouses, wiping out around 10% of the company's storage capacity and leaving many sellers facing significant financial losses. A Wildberries seller said an entire shipment of pet food, worth around nearly $20,000, had been destroyed in the fire.
I opened my seller account and realized that everything there had been destroyed. I just sat down and burst into tears. What else can you do in a situation like this? Given the number of responsibilities I have, I don't know what to do next.
Large businesses were also affected. Clothing retailer Finn Flair estimated that around 35,000 items worth more than $1.2 million were destroyed in the damaged warehouses.
We plan to negotiate with Wildberries. Wildberries is one of our key partners. At the moment, we have information that Wildberries will be making compensation payments. They plan to start with smaller sellers because they were affected the most, and later they will compensate larger sellers as well.
Wildberries said it would need at least 30 days to assess the damage before compensation payments begin. The company has also announced reduced storage fees to support affected sellers. The Kremlin praised Wildberries for offering assistance to affected sellers despite having no legal obligation to compensate businesses. Officials are discussing possible support measures, including state-backed loans, tax breaks and subsidies, with state-controlled lender VTB expected to play a key role. No final decision has been announced. Ukraine said it targeted Wildberries because of its alleged role in supplying the Russian military and its financial ties with the VTB bank. Meanwhile, to cope with the storage crisis, Wildberries is reportedly looking to expand its logistics network in neighbouring Kazakhstan. While Kazakhstan's trade ministry says it has not yet received an official request for additional space, it remains open to the idea. The retailer is already constructing 2 massive hubs in Almaty and Astana to help redistribute goods and stabilise operations.
Now, Russia's Federal Security Service has charged Telegram founder with aiding terrorist activities. The agency said it has also begun procedures to place Pavel Durov on an international wanted list. The FSB alleges Telegram failed to remove channels and bots that have been used to coordinate attacks, sabotage and cybercrime inside Russia. It claims the platform was used by Ukrainian intelligence services and groups Russia designates as terrorists or extremists. There has been no immediate comment from Durov or Telegram. All right, that's all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.